Okay, very welcome to my program, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. This is our third conversation, I think, and it's always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks.
Uh, Start by shortly. I saw your interview with Stephen Gardner's channel around the OCOC, or Our Country, Our Choice. Can you give the Swedish audience a little briefing on what that is? What I understand, it's not political in that sense, or
Well, it's interesting that you ask. This is an organization that was founded last year by a number of people, some of whom were wealthy and decided to invest in the foundation of Our Country, Our Choice. And they gave it that name because they simply discovered, as many of us have in the United States over the last 30 years, it doesn't make a great deal of difference for whom you vote. You get the same bad outcome over and over and over again. And so they said, we've got to find a third way.
Mhm.
And I think the long term goal at this stage is to bring people from the various political parties together, understanding that there is commonality between us as far as Americans are concerned, what we want and what we don't want, and that this could become eventually the foundation for a new party
Mhm.
that could challenge everybody for control of Washington, because Washington is really is a swamp.
Mhm.
And it's controlled essentially by wealthy donors who
Right.
have bought up everyone in Washington to pursue the goals that they desire. That's why we have an open border. That's why we have forces all over the world. That's why we're mired right now in the Middle East and can't seem to get out. And Americans have had it. They said enough's enough.
Yeah.
We're being overwhelmed. 9 million people have poured into this country since January.
Mhm.
And if you look at the illegal migrants that we call them that are already here, they're probably somewhere between 25 and 30 million so-called illegals in our country.
Wow.
And this has got to stop, and they have to be expelled. We
Mhm.
need a restoration of the rule of law. We have to put an end to the criminality in our cities. We have to crush the drug trade. All of this needs to be done, and we have to stop these unnecessary hostilities overseas because there's no threat from Russia.
Yeah.
That's a huge lie and has been from the beginning. And frankly, there's no reason for us to be at war with anybody, whether it's China or Iran.
Yeah.
And this is not because we are quote unquote anti NATO or something like that. That's absurd. We simply think the Europeans need to be their own first responders. They need to find their own way forward. We've been in Europe, Korea, Japan, all of these places for far too long. That's about it. And I think there's a good chance that we're going to be successful. We've only been up and running for 4 months.
Mhm.
We have over 100,000 members,
Wow.
and we're picking up 1,500 to 2,000 new members every week. And frankly, we have a lot of contacts in Europe, people in Hungary, Germany, Austria, France, elsewhere, who are asking us, can we set up similar chapters?
Mhm.
Because our agenda is very simple. We want to preserve our country, our societies, our civilization, our national identity, our culture, our way of life, which is exactly what I think most Europeans want. So
Exactly.
I think this could grow and could ultimately spread to other countries. We're getting inquiries from India for the
Okay.
same purpose. I mean, this is we see this as an essentially a positive approach because it says, look, let's stop fighting people who aren't the enemy far from our shores and focus at home.
Mhm. Makes sense to me. We've started something similar here about 2 years ago. We call it this symbol here. Uh, Basically, it means to push the red or green button to vote, and it's the subtitle is the people's voice. We want the Swedes to, instead of voting in the parliament, we want referendums on
Yes.
all the important questions. Let the people decide. If we would have had the chance to say yes or no to NATO, yes or no to the World Health Organization, yes or no to migration, all those things, we wouldn't have this problem that we have right now. That's our view. That's short about that. And we're growing. We just now are getting media for the first time. The first reaction was that to let people vote That's right. Extremism and racism was
Yeah,
the
of course.
liberal media. You know, the media is the same here as in the United States. They're completely bonkers.
Now,
You
is that word I see on the button is what? Knop?
Knopfdrücken, it means push the button.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
We wanted people's voice, but there was a choir in Sweden, a big choir, in the church that had registered the name, the people's voice, because
Mhm.
they're singing. So we couldn't take that. So we
Sure,
just
sure.
had it for something else. But we're getting a lot of support right now, and probably we'll get into the parliament the next election in 2026. All right, but let's get back to what's happening in a little bit, how Sweden is involved. I have some notes here. You said, I don't remember which program it was, but you said that there's panic attacks now in fear of Russia in Sweden and Finland, and you called the Swedish people sheeple, and I couldn't agree with you more because Swedish people that hasn't seen war in over 200 years, they're notoriously trusting of media and the government. So if the government says, "Well, Russia is a threat," all the media goes out and say Russia is the threat, and the Swedish population believes that without asking a question. Can you elaborate a little bit from your side on this?
Well, I've lived for 10 years off and on in Europe.
Right.
And of those 10 years, I spent two in Belgium, where I was at the Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe. But the rest of the time, I was either serving as an officer in Germany, or I was an exchange student, or I was there as a graduate student in Munich and Vienna and Budapest. So I'm very familiar with the Germans. And one of the things that I discovered when I first visited Sweden, which was in 1978, I think, or 79, I can't remember, one of those two times, is I suddenly discovered that all of the Germanic countries have the same problem. The populations are all too willing to believe whatever the government says,
Mm.
to be instantly obedient, and to march in whatever direction they're told. And the media tend to be an extension of government policy. And I remember sitting in the back of a car in Stockholm. I was in the back seat, and this lady turned around and said, "Well, you haven't buckled your seatbelt." I said, "I know. I hate the damn things. And if I'm not in the front seat, I really don't want to buckle it." And she says, "Oh, but you must." I said, "What?" She said, "Oh, you must." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, the state has made a study and determined that it is good for you to wear the seatbelt." Well, I'm of Scottish ancestry and I'm an American. You put the two together, and my instant response was, "Well, the hell with the government. I don't give a damn what the government says," which, of course, is exactly what my ancestors in Scotland said for several thousand years. And that's what I've been saying, and my ancestors said for the last 400 in this country. So there's an unhealthy uh, sort of compliant nature in
Yeah.
all of the Germanic countries, whether it's the Netherlands or Germany or Sweden or Norway or Denmark, and sadly now in Finland. I used to hold out hope for the Finns because I figured these people are tough.
Yeah.
They won't go down. Well, I've lost that battle. There is no threat from Russia.
Right.
Uh, I think perhaps the Swedes should send a team from wherever they want to send it with cameras and go into Russia. I'm sure the Russians will let them in and simply say, "We're here to film, the first 50 to 100 miles inside Russia, from Estonia to the Arctic Circle." And we would show the people there is no threat from Russia. There are no armies mobilizing. The Russians right now have essentially won this war in Ukraine. They're advancing all across the front, but they're going very slowly and deliberately for various reasons. First of all, the faster you go, the more likely you are to miss a landmine or take a casualty you don't want to take. And they don't want to take casualties. But at the same time, they don't want to kill fellow Orthodox Slavs. They never have. That
mm,
was never Putin's intention.
mm,
And so right now they're saying, well, let's get this thing over with. We're going to move slowly and we're going to have a new buffer zone that reaches up to the Dnieper River. We're going to ultimately cross into Kherson and take Odessa, which is historically Russian, was never part of Ukraine. We're going to go up to Kharkov for the same reason, and that'll be it. We'll call it a day. And that's what they would like to do. But there is no interest in invading Western Europe. And if you're sitting in the Kremlin right now, you look at Russia. Russia is remarkably healthy as a society. The country is stable.
yeah,
It is not some sort of NKVD state run by Stalin. That's all nonsense. That's gone.
yeah,
And there is no interest in expanding that country. They're quite content with what they've got. They wouldn't be in Ukraine right now if the Ukrainians had accepted this idea of equal rights for all their citizens before the law, but they wouldn't do that. And then they tried to transform themselves into an extension of NATO as a platform for attack on Russia. Well, of course the Russians went in there. I'd have gone in there.
yeah,
If that happened in Mexico, I'd go into Mexico unhesitatingly and crush it. So, we've got to wake people up, and they have to understand that this is, after all, the 21st century.
yeah,
No one is really in Europe, as far as Europe goes, there's no one really interested in invading anybody.
right.
And the Swedes are shooting themselves in the foot. The Finns are shooting themselves in the foot by joining this decrepit alliance, which has no reason for existence and is going to die anyway.
Yeah.
It's going out of business.
Yeah, that's oh man, I wish we would reach even more people here in Sweden with these shows. But considering that I estimate that about 5 to 6 million Swedes watch YouTube total, and my shows get at the best 20, 30,000 views, yeah, unique views. So relatively set being such a small country, I'm one of the largest voices, and so
Good.
that is good. And we're going to try to subtitle this one in Swedish as well with the help of Google. It gets a little offbeat, correction and things like that. But Swedes to about 60% understand English quite well. But I discovered that they're not that good. And I lost some of my English as well since I don't speak it daily. But I had the thing that I lived in the United States for 10 years. So, and I knew English before I even went there from school. So,
Well, the Swedes need to remember that English is a halfway house between North Germanic and
yeah,
West Germanic.
right.
It's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
I guess the Germans in southern England agreed that they'd get rid of their definite articles
Hmm.
and change the way they conjugated verbs. And the Norse agreed that they would stop pronouncing words in a certain way that became more intelligible to the Anglo-Saxons, and so you get English.
Hmm.
But the thing with Sweden, and this is very important, the Swedes need to understand this. They've always been held in very high regard in the United States.
Oh,
Now
yeah.
there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons, and I remember growing up as a child, and all of my family served in the world wars. All right, involuntarily, by the way. On the case of my father, he hated it and didn't want nothing to do with it. And my maternal grandfather was in the First World War, and then again came back on duty in the Second and stayed on through Korea. And all of them said repeatedly, it is a terrible mistake. We should never have involved ourselves in what's happening in Europe.
Hmm.
We needed to stay out. We've made a mess. The more we meddle, the worse things get because Americans don't understand Europe. They don't even understand Latin America. They
Right.
don't understand Asia. So we should stay home. Well, staying home was the whole idea of the United States as expressed in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and subsequent administrations up until Wilson in World War I. It was stay home.
Hmm.
And Sweden was always held up as a great example because they had the wisdom, the understanding to remain neutral
Yep.
and out of the mess that we had created. Well, we are now ultimately going to leave Europe, and that's what the Swedes need to understand and the Finns. You're saddling up with someone who's going to sail home, fly home.
Hmm.
We don't live in Europe. Charles de Gaulle said it best in the 1960s. He said, Europeans need to understand something. Britain is an island.
Yeah.
It's not part of Europe. And the Americans don't live in Europe.
Mhm.
When things don't suit us, when things go badly, as they have in places like Vietnam, Iraq, and elsewhere, eventually, what do? We leave.
Yeah.
And we frequently leave a terrible mess in our wake. Look at the mess we've made of the Balkans.
Right.
We've created an unsustainable status quo that requires the presence of foreign military forces. You know, we've been in Korea for over 70 years.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah, but
time to
now
end
Sweden
this.
and Finland have basically invited the United States. In the case of Sweden, they're already named 17 of our military bases. And I can tell you, I know most of them. The ones around Stockholm, they're sophisticated. These are
Mhm.
in the, caves and underground systems. Uh, there are nuclear strike resistant and so forth. And we're just opening that. And another thing is that recently our Minister of Defense, Paul Johnson, he's about as crazy as Lindsey Graham or Anthony Blinken. He said on a question, shouldn't you do like Denmark and Norway, who is already NATO members, write in something in the contract saying that we will not allow nuclear weapons on our territories. The Swedish defense minister said, no, that's not necessary. All right. And Finland and Lithuania, they have passed laws prohibiting nuclear weapons on their soil. The
Mhm.
Swedish guy just says, Paul Johnson, and the prime minister, Ulf Kristersson, which is a even more stupid person. He says the same. No, it's not necessary. But if it's not necessary, why not write it in? You know.
I agree 100%. And now there's talk about returning U.S. nuclear weapons to Great Britain, specifically to England.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
It's complete insanity.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a world now where there are multiple nuclear powers. There's one thing that we learned from the use of the atom bomb in World War II. That's the last resort.
Yeah.
And today, this notion that you can wage a nuclear war and survive, if anybody brings that up, they've lost their minds.
Yeah.
Nuclear weapons can do one thing for the United States and for other countries if they desperately want them. It can preserve your territorial integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we are guilty of having intervened in so many countries that many of these countries are now saying, we'd be pretty stupid not to develop a nuclear weapon of our own because it's the only way to be certain that the Americans will stay out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the worst possible outcome. And instead of what they're doing in terms of willing to host nuclear weapons, and for that matter, our forces, period, they should be looking for ways to get rid of it. I mean, one of the things that we were talking about in 2019 and 2020 was finally signing on for a quote unquote no first use policy.
Uh-huh.
The Chinese already have it. They've already said we will not use a nuclear weapon under any circumstances unless it is used against us. We should take the same pledge.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians would be willing to sign up for that. And of course, the attitude in Washington is, well, you can't trust anybody.
Right.
I have a piece of news for everybody. Nobody trusts us anymore.
Right.
And I don't understand why anybody in Europe would want to put themselves at risk unnecessarily when there is no direct threat from Russia.
Mm.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Do not fire until fired upon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that's about it on Sweden and Scandinavia for right now. Another thing that I reacted to, President Zelensky was in Germany on a, begging tour as he usually does, and stated this to the world that he has at least 880,000 troops, up towards a million, he even said, and he has 30 million Ukrainians at hard work employed in his country. And I started thinking, wasn't there estimates about 500,000 maimed or dead Ukrainian soldiers. Where did he get 880,000 from as far as troops? And where did he get 30 million workers from? Because as far as I understand, the population now in the Ukraine is not even 30 million.
No, Zelensky has borrowed a technique that is unfortunately being increasingly popularized inside the Beltway. When
Mhm.
in doubt, lie.
Yeah.
And so this man who is sitting on top of what is arguably by any measure an organized crime state that is stealing wealth on a absolutely cataclysmic level. If you stop and look at the amounts of money and cash that have been shipped into that country, what has happened to most of it? Where is it? And much of it is sitting in foreign banks.
Right.
I'm sure Zelensky and his fellow crooks have plans, and if things get to the point of total desperation, to fly out and land comfortably somewhere to own their estates, whether those happen to be on the Mediterranean or on the Gulf of Mexico, I have no idea. But we need to keep in mind that this is what you're dealing with. It is truly an organized crime state. Now,
Yeah.
this is not a comment on the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people have been suffering with this for decades.
Yeah.
And I think many of them hoped that this would be a way out. They were wrong. We don't know how many people are still in the country. I'd be surprised if there are 20 million, to be
Yeah.
frank. Millions have left. The prosecutor general of Ukraine, who resigned his post but is now still active, spoke just 10 days ago and said that it was time for the government to tell the truth. The Ukrainians have lost 500,000 dead
Mhm.
fighting the Russians. Everybody has said for months, all the mainstream media, oh, Macgregor's wrong. He's wrong. It can't be. I'm not wrong, and I've never been wrong because I've been listening to people on the ground tell the truth. You have to go to look at the graveyards. You
Yeah.
have to look at the obituaries. You have to listen to what the people are saying and writing into newspapers.
Hmm.
Ukraine is dead as a nation right now. It's barely on life support. And
Hmm.
more Ukrainians are trying to get out. And they can't force people in great enough numbers into the Ukrainian army to keep it rolling. The Ukrainian army is imploding.
Hmm.
Vast numbers are just walking away. Large numbers are being taken prisoners, 70-year-old men, 14-year-old boys, pregnant women. This is ridiculous. This is an atrocity that we are complicit in creating. We in the West have helped to kill Ukraine
Yeah.
when it was never, ever necessary to do so. And everything the Russians have told us has been truthful. There's no reason for hostility to Russia. There's great reason at this point to end this tragedy
Yeah.
so that we can have some measure of stability in Eastern Europe. And I say again, it would be very useful if a Swedish team, for that matter, a Finnish team, would get together with their cameramen, make arrangements, go into Russia, and photograph all the areas across the border from Finland and make it clear there's nothing there.
Hmm.
No one is coming. And again, why would anyone in their right mind in Moscow want to occupy and control Western Europe? It's a
No.
disaster.
Yeah.
It's
They have
Indian
nothing to
destruction.
gain. They have no reason. They have nothing to gain. I mean, Russia is such a large country, the world's largest by area, and it's full of unexploited resources, just loads. And they have no. Russia doesn't even have an intention to rule Ukraine. They don't want that. They want it to be a buffered zone and a neutral place, and they don't want NATO to move up next door to them. That's all. And Lavrov has said this many, many times, and he's
And
very
he's telling the truth.
yeah, of course, yeah.
And Europeans need to beware of certain revanchist elements. Need to understand there are plenty of people, sadly, not most Poles that vote, but in the government in Warsaw who are revanchist. They think this is an opportunity to restore the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Right.
It included most of Ukraine or Ukraine west of the Dnieper, and then certainly Lithuania, which in those days, of course, extended beyond Minsk.
Hmm.
Uh, Come on, listen, boys. If you want to do that, you're on your own.
You're right.
Don't drag us into it. And NATO, when Poland entered NATO, I was on duty in 1999, and there were discussions behind the scenes where several people said, we like the Poles, but is this a good idea?
Hmm.
Their hostility to Russia is a mania. It's almost a disease.
Yeah,
How does
the
how does this help us?
yeah. Now, history of the Poles, of course, they were occupied after World War II by the Soviet Union, and that still
And
remains.
what they don't understand is, remember, we promised them.
Mhm.
Churchill and Roosevelt said, "Oh, well, this is all because of Poland. We'll restore Poland." The Poles seem to have very short memories and haven't figured that out.
Right.
The Poles had alternatives to end up isolated between the Germans and the Soviets,
Yeah.
and they took the wrong path. They flew to London for a guarantee that was worthless
Yeah.
because the Germans and the Russians weren't about to pay any attention to Britain on the continent.
Yeah.
So everybody needs to wake up. This is the 21st century. We live in a better world. We are not living in the late 19th century. This whole business of territorial imperialism was a failure. It's a bust. And you're absolutely right. Anybody who knows anything about the Ukrainians in Western Ukraine doesn't want to rule them. In fact, if you go to the majority of polls and say, "Oh my God, we were there. We don't want to go back," we don't want to deal with the Western Ukrainians, and certainly the Russians don't. But there is no reality. We are dominated by this small group of bizarre ideologues. Applebaum, Blinken. Take your pick. Look at our ambassadors in Eastern Europe. I mean, they're all pushing this war agenda, all with the object of destroying Russia, which makes no sense and is not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I listened to what's his name, John Kirby as well. I mean, that's what a he doesn't understand anything, I think, at all.
Oh,
Uh,
I think he understands. I think he's saying what they're telling him to say, and that we have a lot of that these days in Washington. The truth is a fungible commodity, especially if you're a globalist and a neocon. Doesn't matter.
yeah.
Facts don't matter.
Well, I'll wrap this up for you. We're closing up to a 30-minute program. We could go over time a little bit from as far as I'm concerned. It's about up to you. But what happened in Iran, and I mean, the attack on the American base in Jordan on the border of Syria killed three service people and injured 34, was it? Something like that. And I don't
35.
know how serious it was, these injuries, but it's always serious. Uh, and now guys like Lindsey Graham said, now we need to bomb Iran. We need to strike them hard. And is that, do you think they're going to be that stupid to try to attack Iran? What's your opinion?
Well, I wouldn't exclude it. The stupidity is rampant inside Washington because Washington thinks it's really 1991 and that we enjoy a position of military dominance and economic strength that we no longer have. We have weakened ourselves dramatically over the last 20 years. So we don't have the advantage strategically anywhere at this point. But having said that, I think it's important to know certain things. First of all, whether it's Yemen or Iraq or southern Lebanon, these are Shiite Arabs.
Yeah.
These Arabs were armed not because Iran showed up and said, "Listen, we want to arm you so that you can fight people." They were armed by the Iranians because these various Arabs came to Iran in desperation, asking for help.
Hmm.
There was no Hezbollah, Party of God, in southern Lebanon until the Israelis went into Lebanon and occupied southern Lebanon. Then you get Hezbollah. And Hezbollah said, "We don't ever want to go through this again. Please, please help us." The Iranians helped. In Yemen, the Shiite Arabs called Houthis were attacked violently by Sunni Islamist Arabs from Saudi Arabia, including Al Qaeda.
Yeah.
No one would help them. We were called in by the Saudis to help the Saudis, who couldn't even bomb them effectively, to bomb. Finally, we said no more and walked out. Thank God. All we did was create a famine and harm people that were not our enemies. The Houthis then turned to Iran once again and said, please help us. In Iraq, the Shiite militias were founded to protect the people there from the Sunni Islamists.
Hmm.
The Shiite Arab militias in Iraq liberated Iraqi Christians who
Wow.
had been overwhelmed and conquered by Sunni Islamists. There are reasons why these things exist. But now, because of this campaign to expel or kill the population of Gaza that the Israelis are running, all these Arab groups are now in solidarity with the people of Gaza and Hamas.
Right.
What they're doing is saying, well, if you leave, if you stop what you are doing in Gaza, we will stop attacking you. Within the last few days, we've had several ships pass the Gate of Tears and go into the Red Sea. And most recently, Saudi flagged commercial vessels. They were unharmed.
Hmm.
The Sunnis, or excuse me, the Shiite Houthis are attacking us and anything that is allied with, supportive of, or flagged by the Israelis,
Exactly.
because we and the Israelis are seen as the enemy. Now, there's a simple solution to most of the instability in the Middle East. Biden needs to behave like his successors did in the White House. Make it clear to Mr. Netanyahu that if he persists in this policy of mass expulsion and murder, we will withdraw all of our support.
Hmm.
And retired Israeli generals have said publicly, if the United States did that, we wouldn't last 2 weeks.
Exactly.
So that's the solution, but
Mm.
we won't do it.
Yeah.
And right now, as I've said to everybody, Mr. Netanyahu has far more power, influence, and control in Washington than President Biden. That's what's going on. Americans are not being consulted. No one consulted us. Do we want to kill tens of thousands of Arabs to starve and 500,000 to death and drive 2 million people away? We weren't asked about that. But then again, we weren't really consulted on whether or not we should go to Vietnam and fight against communism thousands and thousands of miles from the United States when the people we were fighting had no particular reason to be hostile to us. I mean, this is a repeat performance of stupidity on steroids. So your question is, could these people bomb Iran? Yes, of course. And
Mhm.
I think what we need to understand, Mr. Netanyahu is absolutely bound and determined that he will remove all of the Arab population from what he calls Greater Israel between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. That's his goal. He will not be stopped. You may have a ceasefire, but it will not end. And if it doesn't end, eventually you will get a regional war because everyone in the region agrees that Sykes-Picot is over. They're not going to tolerate this any longer. So the question is, how does it happen? What sparks it? Where does it begin? I don't know, but I don't see this ending seriously at all this year. I think, in fact, what will happen is probably by the spring, April, May timeframe, this thing will explode onto the scene with virtually everybody in the region involved. Look, in the Egyptian currency has lost 24% of its value in the last 30 days.
Wow.
Egypt is in crisis. If you go back to 1973, there were somewheres in the vicinity of 40 million Egyptians. Today, there are nearly 100 million.
Oh, yeah.
Iran is a nation of 90 million, the size of Western Europe. There are 90 million Turks. If you look at the fragility of the situation in Egypt and Jordan and Syria, there is reason to be very concerned about a major regional war. And this is a war Israel can't win. And Mr. Netanyahu knows that. He's expecting us to win it for him.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's pretty clear. What would happen if Donald Trump comes to power? Some speculation is around that the Ukraine war would end. Uh, I don't think personally, I think he's going to be much better for the American people than the current administration, but I'm not sure that this Donald Trump is the person to solve it by himself or his cabinet. What do you
Well,
think?
I would argue that almost any administration would be an improvement over what's in Washington today. But having said that, there are real questions about our ability to hold a free and fair election.
Hmm.
You know, we've implemented in all of these blue states, in particular, this ridiculous mail-in ballot nonsense,
Yeah. Just for
voting
the
election.
Swedish people, blue states meaning Democrat.
Right. This is an opportunity for fraud on a grand scale. The French tried it and abolished it because it was just unmanageable. There was simply too much corruption and fraud in the system. This is why I'm not sure that anyone could win an election clearly, unambiguously, and fairly in the current environment. So I'm very, very concerned. I mean, I'm not convinced that the last election was not stolen. I can't prove it one way or the other, but I grew up in a major city, and in Philadelphia, we haven't had a really clean election there since the 1960s. In fact, I grew up in an environment where we knew that the 1960 election was stolen in Philadelphia. So
Right.
the point is, there are big problems internally in the United States. So there's no easy answer. Could Donald Trump win? Potentially, but under the circumstances, how do we know?
Hmm.
Uh, I just don't know. RFK Jr. is another very viable and I think legitimate candidate. He's intelligent and thoughtful. I think Trump's instincts are good, but President Trump continues to surround himself with some people that were there under his last administration, and they were terrible. So all of these candidates are currently hostage to this policy of destroy Gaza, destroy the West Bank, and expand Israel.
Hmm.
They are all hostage to that. No one will stand up and say, "Wait a minute." I have always supported Israel. I think Israel is a state that deserves to exist. But how far can you go? Is there no limit to your willingness to support when you start killing and destroying the homes of millions of people with the intent to drive them out, whether or not they are killed or live is of no concern to you? As an American, I find that unacceptable. I can't go along with that.
Hmm.
But I'm not hearing the main candidates say anything about it. In
Hmm.
fact, everyone is silent. There's remarkable little coverage in the mainstream media.
Yeah.
This is a healthy thing for the United States, and I don't think it's something that we should be viewed as supporting and underwriting. But I hold the minority opinion right now.
Yeah. Yeah. We suffer the same problem here in Sweden as well. Uh, here the uncertainty is that you go to vote for. We have 8 parties currently eligible for votes, and you go to vote on one of them, and you think that the Sweden Democrats, quite conservative, they're the second largest party. You vote for them, and then they, after the election, they go together and form coalitions with other people that you didn't vote for. And
Mm-hmm.
what you get is a compromise, and you don't get what you voted for. So it's the same. People in Sweden generally are so tired of hearing that go to vote now, go to vote. You vote on your party, and everybody vote for me, vote for me, vote for me. It doesn't matter who you vote for because they're going to decide after the election what the government will look like. And nobody went out in 2022 before the election we had then and said, we're going to join NATO, so vote for me. Nobody said nothing about
Mm-hmm.
that. After the election, yeah, we'll apply for NATO membership. Nobody voted for that. So that's where we have people's voice. And we're doing quite well now after a while, but we were mostly ignored by the media, but that's lightening up right now. We're getting very much bad media, but that doesn't matter.
Well, I'm often asked by people, well, you've expressed your views on what's happening. For whom would you vote?
Mm-hmm.
And whom would you support? And I stop and I say, well, I guess in the current environment, the best answer is Oliver Cromwell. And they all look at me strangely, but they don't understand. Oliver Cromwell was really decisive in the founding of the United States.
Hmm.
because Cromwell led this revolution. He didn't lead it at the beginning, but he ultimately ended up leading it. And the British had a king in the form of Charles I, who was a disaster,
Yeah.
who was absolutely betraying his own country. Then at the same time, you were dealing with a parliament that was just hopelessly corrupt.
Hmm.
And finally, he dissolved parliament. First, he said about the king, in the name of God, go. He wouldn't go voluntarily, so they rid themselves of the king. Then he went to parliament and he said, you are nothing but whore masters, criminals, and thieves. And he dissolved it. And he ruled Britain for 5 years. And by the way, that 5 year period was very instrumental in the development of modern England and Scotland. So I'm not saying that we need to go to all of those ends or extremes, but I'm very frustrated with exactly what you're describing in Sweden as well as here.
Hmm.
And the Swedes need to keep something in mind that the situation in Israel is very different from Sweden.
Oh yeah.
These Arabs have always lived there.
Yeah.
They were there for thousands of years. We now know if you look at the genetic makeup of the population, they're descended from the original inhabitants who have been through several different iterations of religion, many
Hmm.
of whom were Christians for a long time and then became Muslims, but and many of whom prior to that were Hebrews. In other words, descended from the original population. You're dealing with foreigners. We're dealing with foreigners. These people came. I certainly didn't invite them. I didn't ask them in. We've got 9 million of them that have poured in. We can't sustain it. We can't afford it. We're headed down into an economic spiral. Just look at the bond market. Look what's happening around the world with this unsustainable national sovereign debt. We've got to take some measures in order to preserve our country and our national identity. I think you're going to have to do the same thing. But
Yeah.
it's very different from what's happening in Israel. So parties should not confuse the two.
Exactly. That's good advice. Well, that's about it for our interview today. I appreciate it very much that you can do this in this small, humble channel in Sweden, but I feel it's very important, and I hope we can do it in the once something develops. I'll mail you again and see if we can talk about that in another program.
Well, all the best. God bless you and God save Sweden.
Thank you so much, sir.
Bye
Goodbye.
bye.